Right, hello, so greetings. Good afternoon, this is Thomas Daffern again speaking about, it's kind of my weekly broadcast on Sunday about Brexit and some reasons why I think it's a very bad mistake for UK foreign policy and all kinds of reasons to leave the European Union. And I'm hoping, like millions of other people, that it can be stopped, that we can have a second referendum and that we can think again as a country and vote this time to stay in the European Union. And this week I'm going to be discussing what I think is one of the most substantial arguments in favour of remaining in the European Union, and that's the business to do with Scotland. Last week I talked about Northern Ireland, and that as far as I can see it's 99.99% certain that Brexit will lead to the breakup of Northern Ireland from the UK eventually, and through referendum they would vote to rejoin the Republic of Ireland and remain in the European Union. This week I'm going to be talking about Scotland, which again is a very important situation. I first of all want to just introduce my background on this, as I did with the Irish thing, and explain something of my understanding of Scottish history and culture and why I'm speaking about this and why it's important. I think I've been much more fortunate than most people living and being brought up in England, partly because I've had quite a lot of exposure to Scotland, and I used to go to Scotland to summer camps when I was a child. I used to go to a thing called Forest School camps, which were amazing. They were an eye-opener. Like an early green university type thing, on the Isle of Arran. And I fell in love with Scotland, really, as a child. It was the most extraordinary place, I thought. And it was like the secret of Britain. And so I used to go there and absolutely adored it. A bit like the Hogwarts Express, I'd get the train from Euston, and we'd go all the way to Glasgow and change, go to Kilmarnock and get the ferry across to Arran. And I thought Arran was like paradise. I still do. It's one of the most beautiful spots in the world. I then, as I've told people, I lived in Canada, I lived in London, I lived in Wales, but I used to go to Scotland from time to time to give talks. I lectured at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. In the 90s, I was active in certain, obviously, peace research circles, so that would take me to Scotland for academic work from time to time. During those times, I made a pilgrimage journey to Iona. I'd always wanted to go to Iona, I know its importance. And so I went to this tiny island off the west coast of Scotland, on Argyll, where St Columba lived, and absolutely fell in love with it. It was that was in about 92. And I had this feeling that there's transparency on Iona between this realm and the next realm. The worlds touch, they're very thin, so to speak, the separation. And obviously I'd studied world history, I'd done my degree by then, and so I knew the importance of the Scottish Enlightenment, and being a philosopher and historian of philosophy, I'd studied Hume and all the great Scottish Enlightenment figures, Adam Smith and the whole Scottish tradition. In fact, when I studied philosophy at the University of Bristol, my lecturer in ethics was Scottish, and so in a sense I sat at the feet of that tradition. And not many people realise, but Kant himself, the great philosopher who was key to the teaching at the University of Bristol when I was studying there, was himself part Scottish. Kant, the German philosopher, actually was partly descended from a Jacobite general who'd gone to Germany. And that helped shape his thinking, actually. He was inspired by Hume and by the Scottish Enlightenment to try and think through the parameters of knowledge and a critical theory of consciousness, if you want, which inspired and influenced my work as a philosopher. So I think the whole world owes a debt to Scottish philosophy, not just in the 18th century, but even before that. One of the greatest medieval philosophers was Duns Scotus, who was Scottish, and he came from a Scottish background. He studied at Oxford and then Paris and became the second most influential academic scholastic philosopher, along with Thomas Aquinas. Scotus was a Franciscan who believed that you have to not just think your way to God, but also will and act your way into a divine relationship. That God is not just a thought that you can think to, but a project, a process of being that requires our co-participation, and that we're called to do that through love. In other words, the heart is important as well as the mind. And I agree with Duns Scotus in that. He was a bit like Kant, he was a genius thinker who tried to outthink himself and ended up realising that thought has limitations. You have to go to a place of faith and love, which is beyond, the logic systems that mind, or lesser mind, tends to work with. Of course, there's a divine mind that we can tap into, a Buddha mind, or whatever you want to call it, a Christ logos, that Scotus knew about as well. And that can infuse and inspire the individual will to do good. Anyway, he was a thinker on a par with anything else in Europe, and Heidegger, the great German philosopher, did his PhD on Duns Scotus, and he inspired a lot of German thinkers, actually. So, European academics and philosophers have always been aware of Scotland and taken cognizance of it as a powerhouse of ideas. And therefore it's an important part of the United Kingdom. We're very fortunate in the UK, and I think the history teaching in the UK is pretty abysmal, in England certainly. They don't make enough of the beauty of the whole country. Scottish history should be taught, I think, and Welsh history and Northern Irish and Irish history in general, within a context of wider European history. The history curriculum is very narrow, and the stories of the Scots are fascinating. Then in 2010, I was offered, through circumstances I won't go into in great detail, but through Druid contacts of mine, a castle in Argyll in Western Scotland, to basically, as a charity to run it and look after it. I ended up living there for 7 years in Argyll, and that was a very intense period of learning and teaching for me. I was not working in the secondary school sector like I had been doing for 10 years in England, but I was teaching in adult education and in internationally, so I was travelling a lot. Scotland was the base, but I recorded lectures and commentaries on all 6 Gospels, the Quran, the books of Enoch, and I was doing a lot of very in-depth scholarly research at my time in Scotland, using the University of Glasgow Library, which is a great library. The castle was only about an hour and a half from Glasgow. So I got to know contemporary Scotland, I think, pretty well. I lectured in Glasgow and Edinburgh and travelled a lot. I went to the Orkneys, I went to all different parts of Scotland. I went back to Iona a couple of times and adopted a real close relationship, I think, to Scottish interests, and got to know a lot of fascinating and extraordinary Scottish people, now contemporary. I lived there during the Scottish independence referendum, therefore, and I had to make up my mind which way to vote, and I thought about it very carefully, because a lot of my friends were actually pro-independence. They were telling me, no, Thomas, the Scots have had a long, heavy experience of English occupation. It's time we got rid of it. There's no way of doing it apart from independence. They're not reasonable. And I found this very difficult to swallow, because I've been brought up to think of the English as believing in fair play, kindness, morality, democracy and so on. And the picture I was being painted of the English was a bit frightening. They were like brutes and callous and imperialists who colonised this part of North Britain. So I struggled in my soul, what if what they're saying is true, then I ought to vote for independence. But hang on, my family is English, my background is largely English, my daughters live there. The English aren't all bad people. So I struggled to weigh up these things. And as I looked into it, I then, read all the papers and listened to the news. And the one thing that really made me decide in the end to vote for Remain, to stay inside the UK, was that everyone was told, the Scots were told, we were told, that if you vote for independence now, you'll be kicked out of the European Union. And that'll be it. Bye-bye Scotland, you'll be a little independent state, and the rest of the UK will prevent you getting back into the European Union. Big Brother in Westminster will block it. And I think that swung, actually, the independence referendum for remaining inside the UK. It was a fear card that was played, and it kind of worked. I mean, it certainly worked with me, because I thought, hang on, Scotland isn't going to be that big and powerful to stand up in this big world all alone if it's outside the EU and outside the UK. No, I mean, for the sake of Scotland, actually, as well as the whole UK, I decided, no, it's better we stay together as a nation. So I voted Remain in 2016. 2014, wasn't it? And that side won just, and so Scotland voted to stay inside the UK. But it was very close, and I don't think most English people living south of the border, realise how close that result was. And I've come to the view that if there is a second independence referendum now, that independence will win. I think I'm 100% certain of that. I'll come back to that in a minute. Because basically the independence movement was squashed with a whole bunch of lies emanating from Westminster. And what I think people have now seen through is that, how dishonest and disreputable the Westminster machine is, and the media that prop it up, the largely right-wing media, the Telegraph, Mail, etc. It is actually extraordinary when you look at things from a bigger cosmic perspective or an internationalist perspective, how narrow and propagandistic these London-based media organisations are, and how they just trumpet the Westminster government's line. So I think one of the big realisations I've had, and it's been a long, slow growth, is that Scottish independence is now, I think, inevitable. It will happen within my lifetime and your lifetime. The question is what form and how and when, and how will it be managed, and what will be the implications for the rest of the UK. Right, so I think the argument has totally shifted now, because whereas before the argument in favour of Brexit was that let me go back to a slightly different route. Let me ask the question next: why is Brexit happening? I mean, we had that independence referendum for Scotland that was won by no, let's keep the UK together, which is what I voted for, just, and everything should be fine. We should be able to settle down and live together. But suddenly, this Brexit referendum appears in 2016, kind of out of nowhere, out of the right wing of the Conservative Party. We had a fairly moderate Conservative Liberal alliance that was trying to get the economy on an even keel. It was doing a reasonable job. It was not an extremist government, it was a moderate, reasonable government. And yet suddenly, because the Liberals lost power, which I think was a tragedy, the Conservatives under David Cameron were then able to be susceptible to the pressure from the right wing to bring in this Brexit referendum, out of nowhere, really. The people as a whole in the country were not pushing for it. And certainly all the people I'd met in Scotland, I never met a single person that was in favour of Brexit or of even having a referendum. On the contrary, most of the people I met in Scotland, I'd say all of them, are extremely tolerant, open, internationalist in their outlook and very pro-European. Most of the Scots I met have travelled in Europe, they've studied there, they've done exchange years, they've done Erasmus programmes. A lot of the hotel industry and the tourist industry in Scotland depends on European Union people coming and working. during the summer months. Where I lived in Argyll, there was a hotel up the road which was constantly staffed with Lithuanians and Poles and whoever, interesting people who loved Scotland and had chosen to come and live and work there for 6 months or whatever. Scotland is quite thinly populated in comparison to the whole of Britain and England, and so the Scots actually welcome immigration, and so if more European Union people want to come and settle in Scotland, they're very happy. I met some extraordinarily interesting and fascinating people from European Union countries that had come to live in Argyll and were succeeding, in spite of the harsh weather and the terrible winters and all the rest of it, to have a great life with their Scottish colleagues, and there was a bit of intermarriage going on. And it was all working fine. I dread to think what's going to happen to those communities throughout Scotland which have welcomed European Union people to come and live amongst them. And in return, I know that lots of Scots have gone and experienced different parts of Europe, living abroad, and very happily. That card of freedom is incredibly important to the Scots, and to the rest of Europe as well. Most Europeans I talk to, when they say, "Oh, where have you been?" "I've been living in Scotland for the last 7 years." "Oh, I love Scotland," they say. They may not have even been there, but they love the scenery. It's very romantic in the imagination of Europe. And this is true. This goes back to for quite a few hundred years, Scotland played an important role in the European Romantic period. People like Goethe and they all had Ossian as a poet, even though English literary figures said, no, Ossian is a fake, Macpherson faked it all. Actually, it seems to go back to some genuine oral traditions of bardic poetry that was around in Gaelic in the Highlands, which Macpherson obviously embellished and improved, so-called. But people like Napoleon loved Ossian. They had him under his pillow. Napoleon used to sleep with that book of poetry, under his pillow. So the whole European Enlightenment and Romantic period was fired up with Scottish culture. And Sir Walter Scott was the most famous novelist, early historical novelist in European history, and he was a European writer. He actually married a French woman who he fell in love with, who came to live with him at Abbotsford, and she was as French as you can get. Walter Scott was a European, and if you go to his library, which is now preserved in Abbotsford, it's very worth a visit, that place, this amazing castle, like a bigger version of the one I was living in. It's full of classics, European literature and so on. Goethe loved Walter Scott's writings, and he was very influential on a European stage. So this idea of small Scotland, being happy to be cramped back into the attic of the UK instead of being allowed to be a European nation once again, I think is not feasible. This is why Scotland, culturally and intellectually, is a European country, and will therefore, if the only way it can get that is to vote for complete independence sooner rather than later, it's going to do that. And I know that Nicola Sturgeon and her colleagues are weighing this up as we speak. The form of Brexit, I think, has been absolutely disastrous. You see, the Scottish people did not vote for Brexit. They voted consistently and by a large margin in favour of Scotland remaining as a member of the European Union. So all the kind of rhetoric that comes out through the right-wing media of we've got to respect the 2016 referendum and do Brexit makes absolutely no sense the minute you travel north of the border. I have a map here of Scotland. It's as long as the rest of the UK is. I mean, Scotland is the top half of the United Kingdom, and it's got Orkney and Shetlands and so on off even further up. Now that huge part of the country voted to remain in the European Union. And I find it absolutely incredible. I mean, as a political scientist, I find it literally incredible that the Conservative Party, supposedly a conservative and unionist party, supposedly wanted to keep the UK together, simply misprocessed the election result in 2016. They never looked at it properly. I don't know, have they got a problem with figures or something? The figures were very clear. Scotland voted to remain in the European Union. And that wish should be respected. Whatever constitutional arrangements or juggling about or this or that should be done, must respect that Scotland voted to remain in the European Union. I find it scandalous when I watch in Parliament. You know, I was brought up, as I said before, to have a sense of fair play. Justice has to prevail in the state. It has to be the foundation of authentic governance and democracy. If you veer from that, you just go over a cliff, you know. And so fair play and justice demand that Scotland's voice in the 2016 referendum should be respected. Scotland has to remain as part of the European Union. And so that's my position. Now, yet, on the contrary, what we've seen is the Tory party, the largely English MPs, humiliating the Scottish MPs, the SNP MPs, and you know, baying at them like dogs in a hunt. You know, no, we're going to force this Brexit on you. It's like a children's game. It's reduced the Commons to a laughing stock of Europe, and I think it's brought severe disrepute to that institution. I used to work in Parliament as a research organiser for Lord Ennals, who was a very fine man, Labour peer. I chaired with him about 30 meetings in the House of Lords and used to go and listen to debates all the time in the Commons. At the time when John Major was Prime Minister, I've never experienced such a poverty of debating and such a trivialisation of the substantial issues before the British people at the moment. The quality of debates is scandalous, and the Tories, I think, are the worst. I mean, with all due respect, they're behaving like, you know, like very badly behaved kids. As a teacher, I know when kids are misbehaving, and this lot really are. And Theresa May is one of the worst. She's smug, she smirks, she's rude to Mr Corbyn, she's rude to everyone that shows any sign of independent thinking. I mean, she was rude to me in a letter correspondence exchange. I won't write to her again. She's that rude. It's not worth my while. She's off the scale rude. And I think the British people and the Scottish people, you know, deserve far better than to have their country destroyed by such an unethically grounded politician. As you know, one of my main campaigns is to organise, and I launched this when I was living in Scotland in the castle, a campaign that all MPs and Lords should swear a duty of parliamentary veracity oath when they take office. They're not allowed to lie in office about substantial matters, not private personal stuff, but, you know, weighty political matters. And I'm afraid that most of those MPs, the Tories, would not be in Parliament still if that oath were in office, which I think it must be brought in as soon as possible. And it can be brought in also in the devolved administrations in Wales and Scotland and in the European Parliament. Until we get politicians actually able to tell the truth. I mean, what's to lose if you tell the truth? You tell the truth, and that's the fabric of everything that we have as a society, not just as a nation, but as a world society. The same oath should be brought in the US, in Congress, in India, and other parliaments around the world, Canadian and so on. But what we're seeing in Westminster is the complete opposite. We're seeing a smug, pseudo-democracy at work, which is actually not representing the will of the majority of the people of the UK. If you add up the number of votes that were cast at the last election, the Conservatives don't have a majority of support behind them. And yet they're pushing this Brexit down the throats of the Scots. So I'm very annoyed on behalf of the Scots. I mean, I'm a kind of honorary Scotsman. I lived there, as I say, for 7 years and threw my heart and soul into that experience and travelled all over and studied Scottish history. And I'm ashamed of what the Conservative Party are doing. I mean, I've had friends who are members of the Conservative Party. I've known, Conservative intellectuals, and I've studied the history of the Conservative Party, and it is shameful what this current batch are doing. They're the complete opposite of true Conservatives. People like Anna Soubry and Dominic Grieve and one or two others are authentic Conservatives that realise the horror show that's going on. let's just do an objective cost-benefit analysis of Brexit as it's being offered to Scotland and Britain, as it's being imposed on people. I mean, this is a simple way of adding up the costs and benefits of proposed actions. What are the benefits from Brexit that are becoming clear? Well, it's very hard to think of any, to be honest. I've tried to, be fair here. I suppose there's a sort of mythical regaining of sovereignty, but actually what is that sovereignty and who's it coming to? It seems it's been snatched back by the Westminster Parliament, and they're going to hold on to it. And we have the horrible prospect of these kind of fanatical Tories acting like dictators over the rest of the UK forever. I mean, they can pass laws, they can give each other gongs so they go up to the Lords, and we're going to get a sort of embedded aristocratic pseudo-conservative, because they're not authentic conservatives. These people are misusing power to just self-perpetuate. So I don't think that's really what can be meant by reclaiming sovereignty. Because sovereignty, once it was shared in the European Union, it then is devolved to us all. We all become some kind of European citizen. We have rights under European law as well as British law. We have rights of freedom of speech. We have rights of freedom of assembly. We have certain social rights. We have rights to, all kinds of things, which it seems to me the UK Parliament are now trying to destroy under this bunch of MPs. There's another sort of thing. The Brexit people seem to want some kind of racial superiority thing. It's that seriously, jaded in their thinking. But Britain for the British, keep the foreigners out, kind of nonsense. Well, I'm afraid that kind of sovereignty is not something that I think is really worth having. I mean, I think the true strength of a people is its inclusiveness, its capacity to love. The greatest intellectual leaps and breakthroughs have happened in world history when cultures intermesh and intermingle, like happened in Andalusia, the Cordoba Caliphate, when Jews, Christians and Muslims worked together for advancing scientific and philosophical ideas. It happened in California in the 60s when people would come from all over the world, and there was input from Spanish, American and Chinese and Japanese and all kinds of intellectuals there coming up with the computing age and the Jewish community of America, and everyone was doing their best to think through alternative and visionary stuff. So I think that a Europe or a Britain that is looking inward back to its racial sovereignty is simply lost the plot, actually. Because Britain is a multicultural amalgam of cultures. And one of the things I love about London, for instance, where I lived happily for many years, is it is a melting pot of the whole of humanity. That's its strength. That's why it's an authentic capital. And that's why it voted to remain in the European Union. So its voice has also been ignored. Okay, what about another benefit from Brexit? Well, tax breaks for the very wealthy, the people with offshore accounts in Jersey and all the rest. The Rees-Mogg types and the Philip May types and the people that he bankrolls. I can see a benefit for leaving the European Union because they're trying to clamp down on tax avoidance. But it's shocking that the people of England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland suffer, the vast mass of the people, because a wealthy elite who are doing illegal stuff, actually, pretty much, or certainly unethical, have been able to literally hijack Parliament and do a coup in the Tory party, force out intelligent people, stick something in Theresa May's water to change her brain into some funny soft mush, and literally do a coup internally on the British people so that they can push their tax benefits through. I mean, the sooner this is stopped and seen through, and Corbyn and the Labour Party, the SNP, the Liberal Party, and the moderate Conservatives who've somehow been immune to the water poisoning that's going around, need to come together and stop it. I mean, that's why we need a second referendum. the British people have seen through this coup, which is what it is, and we now need to stop it. Okay, those are the advantages of Brexit. What are the costs of, my analysis is that if Brexit is pushed down the throats of the Scots, I'm 100% certain they're going to vote for independence completely and totally and utterly. And to be honest, if I was still living in Scotland, I would too. Like Craig Murray, the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, who saw what the UK state does in its illegal operations around the world and dared to stand up against it and had his career, they tried to destroy it. He's now become a very vocal opponent of the UK government and a great supporter of Scottish independence. I did meet him at a Scottish festival, and he has come to a position of 100% support for independence. I'm slightly different. I take on board all he says critical of the UK state. I still believe it can be turned around from within. And I still believe that sense of fair play and righteousness can still prevail even in Westminster, with the right education, with a licensing system for politicians that they don't lie, with redrawn parliamentary boundaries that are proportional to the number of votes, and so on. There are a number of things that can be brought in to improve the standard of thinking that goes on in Parliament. What I tried to do in Parliament, by the way, is, as a philosopher of peace, I tried to organise a bunch of seminars on ethics and philosophy and so on. We had faith leaders, we had Buddhists and Jains and Sikhs and Sufis coming into Parliament at meetings I chaired, discussing with politicians, most of them members of the House of Lords, about bigger picture issues, about how the British Parliament and people can contribute to peace worldwide. I still think that's an incredibly important conversation to be having. And that's one of my main reasons for wanting to see the UK stay in the European Union and do its bit for peace. I've been trying to get a European Union Mediation Service going, and still will continue. It could be based in Edinburgh. That would be a very good venue for it, as a neutral mediation that would help solve conflicts like Ukraine and elsewhere, the Catalan thing, things that are happening in Europe or on the frontiers of Europe, and that could be available for the whole Mediterranean region, so Palestine, Syria, Israel, these problems, even Yemen and so on. What do we gain if there's, on the contrary, a hard breaking up of Brexit happens, it's forced down the throats by Theresa May, and as I say, the Scots are then going to go pretty soon, I think within a matter of months, if not weeks, for a second independence referendum vote, and they will get it. They will do whatever it takes, and they will get agreement. I think, as I say, then independence will happen. So what's the advantage of that? Well, I can't see, for the Scots, a tremendous sense of reclaimed sovereignty. They would be cheering and whooping for joy in the streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow, and it would be a fantastic party. And I think the whole of humanity would be kind of relieved, actually, that this UK dragon, which seems to have gone mad, has had its fangs taken out. But as the jubilation settles down, we'd be facing years of what I call oil wars. There would be legal battles over where exactly the line is drawn in the North Sea, who owns which bit of the oil reserves of the North Sea, of which there are still substantial amounts left. The Scottish and English governments would be fighting over that for years and years, spending lots of money on expensive lawyers.